Okay, hello everyone. So today, this is the last lecture that is coming from me for this particular class of vernal pools. So we are going to talk about the different aspects of conservation and threats encountered by vernal pools and vernal pool occupants, um, and how to conserve those critical habitats. Now, we know, through our previous lectures, we discussed the fact that vernal pools are critical habitats that confer high fitness and high survival for certain species that can only complete their life cycle successfully in vernal pool habitats. However, the national policies, at least, we are talking about the United States. So within the United States, the national policies for conserving vernal pools are kind of lagging behind. And in other words, there's little science that has been considered into those conservation policies. The protection, or rather the effective conservation of vernal pools require protection of the pond basin, should consider the hydrologic variability, the water quality, management of proper water quality that is optimal for amphibian breeding, reproduction, and for the well-being of other organisms, availability of critical food sources in the correctly timed way, connectivity between different vernal pools and other type of habitats, protection of the upland forest in the immediate upland as well as throughout the rest of the watershed. And conservation of vernal pools in private lands is extremely critical because there's already large number of documented vernal pools located in non-public lands. But the current conservation policies or conservation efforts do not pay much attention to protecting vernal pools in private lands. So, in order to successfully conserve vernal pool across the landscape scale, it's really important to gain in support from the private sector, from private individuals, also to raise dollars from public support. So this can only be done by enhancing public awareness because many people may be incognizant of or unaware of the importance of vernal pool conservation for overall biodiversity conservation. Um, so, and also for monitoring activities, for documenting presence of vernal pool, you may require volunteer participation. There's some local, like town and county level, as well as state level actions that may actually ensure conservation of vernal pools. Um, for example, listing vernal pool dependent amphibians as rare or threatened uh, or endangered species in the State Endangered Species Act, and also land acquisition from private landowners to protect vernal pool habitats. Currently, in Massachusetts, Maryland, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Minnesota, there and Ontario of Canada, there are successful vernal pool monitoring and conservation programs going on, including some satisfactory policies being in place. But the critical point is that issues encountered by the vernal pools are kind of universal. So, what are the different types of threats encountered by vernal pool? First, let's talk about the physical destruction of the vernal pool habitat, the basin as well as the surrounding. Let's talk about how that actually happens. Um, so vernal pools, like many other type of wetlands, could be filled, drained, or dredged, right? Now draining means kind of ditching it, making it it's kind of draining the water out of it. Dredging is kind of plumbing it so that you make the vernal pool a little bit deeper. Why? Well, why filling? Well, because it's with the seasonal flooding, inundation, variable hydrology, those are not suitable for farming. So filling it up or draining it down makes it suitable for farming, right? And there's a lot of organic matter in the vernal pool, so it makes quite a good fertile soil for farming activities. Um, because of the seasonal drawdown, it's not suitable for stocking fish, not suitable for create as a habitat for waterfowl, right? And not suitable for irrigation. There's not enough water, and not enough water when it is much needed. Okay, so it's not suitable for storage. So because of that, vernal pools tend to be kind of dredged, plowed in to increase the water holding capacity so that it can be used for all of those anthropocentric needs. Um, and also historically, we have no idea what happened actually, but there are certain you can make educated guesses, the impacts of pioneers and European settlers on vernal pool habitats and the surrounding landscape. So the deforestation by pioneers as well as European settlers, and even what's happening today, could impact overwintering adult foraging grounds, emerging adult foraging grounds, right? Reproducing adult foraging grounds, and also it is the surrounding vegetation that provides the base of the food web in vernal pools as dead and decaying organic matter. But if you remove the upland vegetation, you're kind of removing the critical food web base for vernal pools. And also, with the loss of the riparian cover, vernal pools undergo dramatic changes in hydrology, loses its hydrologic stability, making it unsuitable for most of the pond breeding amphibians. And also, I mentioned that vernal pool amphibians requires connectivity across the landscape, right? Connectivity to other vernal pools, connectivity to other types of habitats. So deforestation in the uplands could result in loss of landscape permeability, so kind of break the meta community dynamics in that particular habitat. Um, but aftermath of the European settlements, pioneer settlements, the farmlands were abandoned, but and the good news is, it didn't take very long for the forests to regenerate in the eastern North America. Um, but then, subsequently, after the post-European settlement, post-pioneer settlement, there was multiple repeated sequence of waves of deforestation. That is kind of ubiquitous all over the eastern North America. Real estate development and commercial development, urbanization, it's the most current trend of creation of subdivisions, um uh, kind of alterations for industrial scale agriculture, um and also um commercial scale lumbering, okay, which is practiced by the private timberland owners, can also be detrimental for amphibians because there's less natural ponds in timberlands, right, compared to actual forest, compared to like natural forests. And also pond density tends to be lower in numbers and smaller in sizes in cities and towns than in rural exurban areas. Now, another threat encountered by vernal pools stems from the anthropogenic or human-centered modifications of the natural hydrologic regimes of vernal pools. So, here we are talking about any change that have occurred by humans, that is kind of driven by humans, that results in changes in the water source for the vernal pool, which then goes kind of escalates into changes in the depth profile, entire water volume, timing of filling and drawdown. Now, ultimately, these kind of all of those leads to creates new hydrologic regimes. Like unprecedented fluctuations in water levels to which species may not be accustomed to. For example, deforestation in the uplands and creation of additional impervious layers, like roads or paved areas or buildings, which actually kind of channelizes, like kind of directs water that flows through the surface into the water pool, not to the groundwater. So that kind of, all of those activities um, changes the hydrologic regime in the vernal pool. What does deforestation do? Well, deforestation removes the forest cover. It kind of increases evapotranspiratory water loss, and also uh, indirectly too, it actually changes the hydrologic modifications within the vernal pool. Um, and also with presence of impervious layers, you may experience a greater water input during the storm season, could increase the depth, right, and also increase the flooding season. Now, regional species pool may not be adapted to this kind of variation in the hydrology of the vernal pool, so they may not be able to successfully complete their life cycle there. And also, Through impervious layers, as you can imagine, the overland flow, the surface runoff can be directed to the vernal pools, and that could actually lead to sudden surge in water levels after a storm, even outside the growth period. Um, and imagine what happens to drought intolerant species or drawdown intolerant species if the vernal pool draws down really fast because there's no protection from canopy, right? So what will happen to community composition with that kind of changes? What will happen to the waterborne predators, right? If the hydro period is longer, you will have you will encourage colonization of aquatic predators, right? If the hydro period is too short, then you actually kind of repelling establishment of any waterborne predators. Um, and dredging impoundments and impoundment means what? Damming. Dredging means what? Digging for the rain. And shoreline clearance, removal of vegetation around the pond, right? Um, those kind of activities, is a way people kind of redevelop vernal pools for recreational purposes. The So why shoreline clearance? Well, when you have shoreline, you don't see the water, right? Open water has a very high aesthetic value, right? Dredging deepens the water level, right? So therefore, it's suitable for stocking fish when there's a greater volume of water. So, and also certain vernal pools kind of have an outflow, right? If you impound it, so you're kind of preventing, the outflow. So the water keeps accumulating in the vernal pool and it becomes deeper, right? So these kind of activities kind of increases the recreational and the aesthetic value of the vernal pool but loses the biological integrity if you do any of these. Water withdrawal. Well, not directly withdrawing water from the vernal pool itself. Usually, if you actually dig wells and tap groundwater, if you channelize overland flow or surface runoff or stream flow away from the vernal pool, right? Um, for irrigational purposes or any kind of a land management purpose, you are kind of, increasing the drawdown frequency of a vernal pool and kind of reducing the hydro period. Um, so imagine what happens, the cutoff of the overland flow could result in it'll decrease the hydro period, and with lower hydro period, mole salamander breeding or completion of mole salamander larval stage may be hindered. Now let's talk about how vernal pools are threatened by habitat isolation and fragmentation. So hydrologic connectivity is quite important in clustered vernal pools for many different reasons, particularly for much more important for invertebrate dynamics, invertebrate community interactions, invertebrate population dynamics, as well as for a certain degree to maintain population dynamics for salamanders and amphibians. And amphibians are highly selective for clustered vernal pools that are connected. Although they might be, I know that we mentioned that certain salamanders that we talked about could breed in more than one vernal pool, right? And if the vernal pools are clustered around, they could actually they prefer that because that's kind of going back to the idea of putting few eggs in multiple baskets. Like that's kind of a thing. And yes, of course, there are certain amphibians that only breeds in one vernal pool, but many of the secondary vernal pool indicators or facultative vernal pool occupants could lay several batches of eggs in a given season in multiple vernal pools located in a given cluster. So in order to facilitate this cluster level interactions between vernal pool species and the vernal pool environment, you need to have connectivity between those vernal pools. So isolation of vernal pools could actually damage that kind of activities. And what else maintains the functional connectivity between pool clusters? Intermittent streams that is formed between vernal pools during spring season, during snow melt, during spring rain. Okay, spring flooding, right? Snow melt can actually create connectivity between vernal pools, right? Groundwater. Vernal pools could interact through groundwater discharge and recharge. So these kind of connectivity among vernal pools is important to maintain. gene flow, and metapopulation interactions. And also, we mentioned that many salamanders, many amphibians have very high fidelity for a particular breeding site. So, how do they, move back and forth between their adult habitat to breeding habitat or to larval habitat if there's no connectivity between the different types of habitat? So connectivity is extremely important, not just between different vernal pools, between vernal pools and other non-vernal pool habitat. So what results in fragmentation? It is largely infrastructure and land development, agricultural activities, industrial farm, subdivisions, largely roads, because these salamanders are really not really bad at crossing roads. um And continuing on, we'll talk about the impact of altering the habitat structure at watershed scale and how that impacts or threatens vernal pools. So largely this is happening, at the watershed scale, not at the riparian or immediate upland. So urbanization, forestry practices, or silviculture. Now, silviculture means growing forests, so managing and maintaining forests simply for lumbering and logging purposes. Now, and also road development, kind of leads to fragmentation across the watershed and leads to road kills of amphibians or increasing the stress of amphibians that is crossing the roads to get into different kind of habitats from or between vernal pool. Um, and yes, we kind of mentioned about the fact that watershed scale development um, or land modifications could lead into could kind of lead to fragmentation of habitats and loss of habitat connectivity through across the watershed. And development or creation of impervious layers, urban land cover types across the watershed scale can also lead to variation in the hydrology. The same thing happens when you when deforestation happens across the watershed scale. So land clearing and presence of impervious layers increases runoff, and increased runoff could lead to increased hydro periods. And changes in the surface microtopography, changes in the natural geomorphological contours can also impact changes, or can also lead to changes in the urban runoff, um, and also a redirection of stormwater, right? Particularly through by the means of stormwater canals. If you kind of redirect the stormwater runoff in urban environments away from vernal pools or away from any other natural wetland, then of course um, you are that kind of activities could actually reduce the hydro period of vernal pool. And channelizing rivers, right? River channelization is also done to prevent flooding. So what you do is you kind of a river that meanders is kind of converted into a straight channel with a particular gradient that actually hastens the discharge of water. So kind of, engineering wise, it should prevent flooding. But, right now we know that river channelization doesn't help anything at all. So river channelization too could prevent river flooding feeding into vernal pools. So it could lead to a reduced hydro period in vernal pools. Um, These kind of watershed scale modifications in the land use land cover types can also alter the pH regime, the amount of minerals and nutrients available, and that could actually impact the algae and other phytoplankton communities in the vernal pool, completely changing the community structure and community successions in vernal pool habitats. Um, and also, speaking of minerals and nutrients, think about what happens with road de-icing. Where all that minerals, all that salts could accumulate in one input. When it does, it's really difficult to flush it out. Silviculture. I mentioned what silviculture is before. It's actually managing a timberland for logging and lumbering purposes. Um, so when you remove vegetation for lumbering or logging purposes, you are kind of also removing the source of leaf litter input, right? And also, vegetation when it is present on the ground, it helps to retain, kind of assimilate nutrient, right, from um, from the overland flow, from the surface runoff. So when you remove the vegetation, all the minerals, salts, could actually end up from the terrestrial environment into the nearby aquatic habitats, including vernal pools. So silviculture could lead to increased nutrient loading in vernal pools. Um, and also with the removal of vegetation, right, or the canopy cover, you increase the sunlight penetration. So algae could proliferate in vernal pools. Standing vegetation, emergent vegetation can grow profoundly, right? So you could look into immense changes in the habitat structure. Um, if you remove the vegetation, if any form of logging happens in the watershed scale. And also, without the canopy cover, the temperature increases. Without vegetation, sedimentation, and erosion increases. So we are looking at a lot of changes happening in the vernal pool with silvicultural practices or any other form of deforestation across the watershed scale. So these kind of activities could lead to complete change in the tree composition, tree communities in the watershed. Changes in the age structure, changes in the coarse woody debris and large woody debris supplied to the vernal pool as well as to the vernal pool, which are different types of resources for vernal pool occupants, right? And also certain vernal pools that suffer from reduced hydro period could act as population sinks. Um, Another interesting situation where that threatens vernal pools is actually mosquito control, right? To eliminate larval stages of dipterans, right? There are many things that are practiced by landowners, private landowners, and health and human services of towns, counties, and states. That includes um, cleaning and clearing out ditches, draining ditches, removal of streamside vegetation, filling wetlands, right? All of those activities are different ways you can destroy a vernal pool, right? Or sometimes um, adding chemicals that create a surface film on water, which actually breaks the surface tension of water, and that prevents oxygen mixing into the water. Or so certain diptera that actually absorbs dissolved oxygen can die in that way. Not only that, um, many mosquito larvae, they breed directly from air. Okay, so if you have kind of a oil-like substance floating on water, these mosquito larvae cannot breathe, so they can die. But adding that kind of surface film could kill any other invertebrate that are breed that actually absorb oxygen in the same way as mosquitoes, right? And it also damages the mobility or the entire natural history of surface-dwelling invertebrates. And some of the persistent organic pesticides that have been historically applied for mosquito larval control um, could be bioaccumulated across food chains. And most of the chemicals used for mosquito control could have a very high non-target effects, meaning you're applying it to reduce the population of mosquitoes, but essentially you might be killing dragonflies and damselflies and frogs. Pollution is also known to threaten amphibians in many different ways. Um, Within the last decade or so, even before that, there has been many documentations where amphibians that breathe in vernal pools suffering deformities, having extra limbs, missing limbs. Well, first of all, there is a particular parasite that could also lead to amphibian deformities, but there are certain situations where amphibians suffer deformities that is unrelated to parasitism. Okay, so these kind of deformities can come from accumulation of pesticides in the vernal pool, and from there into the vernal pool, into the amphibian biomass. Um, and certain pesticides can act as an endocrine disruptor and kind of mess up with the overall hormonal regulation of growth and development, or sexual maturity, or metamorphosis of amphibians. And acidity, increased acidity of water has been observed in many vernal pools, particularly in the northeastern, probably as a result of acid rain and acid precipitation. Now, increasing acidity mobilizes metals in the vernal pool, right? So metals are usually present in lower concentration, mostly adsorbed into these sediments, but acidic water causes releasing of these metal ions back into the water column. Presence of excess concentrations of certain ions like aluminum could actually impair embryonic development, which could lead to deformations. And also, again, like I mentioned earlier, think about the road de-icing. right? To de-ice roads, you put salt, right? And those salts end up in vernal pools, and that could impact developmental trajectory, maturity, and growth. And feeding, foraging of vernal pool breeding amphibians. And the same thing regarding accumulation of heavy metals. And then, like I just mentioned earlier, the impacts of acid deposition and also accumulation of biopharmaceuticals. All of those could have very negative consequences um, in amphibians ecology and impair their life cycle. So, what kind of conservation actions can we take to promote conservation of vernal pools? First, well, the traditional way. Find out ways to delineate, declare more conservation lands in forms of national parks at federal level, state parks or state forests at state level, national forests at federal level, state forests at state forest, um, wildlife refuge, wildlife reserves, sanctuaries at private level, land ownership level. So there are many ways or many types of conservation lands that can be declared. Um, and also there are many policies at federal, state, and provincial level, as well as at private land ownership level that can be implemented or used to protect vernal pools. So, you Clean Water Act, um, Endangered Species Act. Those are two federal level regulations. Connecticut's Inland Wetland and Water Resources Act, Massachusetts Wetlands Protection Act, two state level acts that specifically supports conservation of vernal pools and that can be used to promote furthermore policies to ensure protection of vernal pools. Now, these regulations, at the state level, provincial level, or federal level, requires revisions where the vernal pool should be recognized as a multi-habitat system. Um, why multi-habitat? Because effective conservation of a vernal pool requires protection of the pool basin, uplands, while considering pool size into the equation because smaller vernal pools tends to be smaller. Although there are regulations that supports wetland conservation, vernal pools are forgotten because they are smaller in size. So those rules should be revised, which supports conservation of vernal pools, including those that are quite smaller in size, because their size may not be necessarily related to their biological importance. And most of the state and provincial regulations on vernal pool conservation are limited by administrative boundaries. So new regulations should go beyond those administrative and political boundaries. It's more ecologically meaningful to reenact these laws where the recognizing the border not from the administrative viewpoint but from an ecological viewpoint, a watershed is a better, ecologically more meaningful boundary that may be kind of used when revising these policies. Um, Vernal pool, vernal pool, the development or alteration of vernal pool habitats for land development purposes are usually supported or not discouraged because that developmental activities may confer many financial and economical benefits. So there should be some sort of a permitting process that actually kind of weighs in the ecological attributes of losing a vernal pool due to land development. So going back to the previous point of kind of trans administrative boundary policies and conservation of vernal pools, there's a lot of talk going on regarding landscape scale conservation planning, which actually where vernal pools are included as one of the habitats. They're one of the critical habitats. So where vernal pools are not conserved as an individual habitat, rather as habitat complexes embedded within the wetland aquatic habitat gradient with the inclusion of immediate, adjacent, and watershed scale uplands and forests. Also, kind of developing policies that supports land use zonation, where land development is only limited to certain parts away from the vernal pools, could also support protection of vernal pools while allowing development to happen. And also, I mentioned earlier that private lands should be integrated into um, the conservation land network. So, in order to support private land owners who are pro conservation, providing tax breaks would be a really cool idea. And also, for private lands, we need to introduce best management practices, particularly if those private lands are under utilities for logging, lumbering, or agriculture. Um, Continuing on into suitable actions that can be taken for conservation of vernal pools. We did talk about the zoning tools, which actually includes setting aside certain critical lands for conservation and ensuring the development will not take place. And in zonation, you kind of have a greater extent of lands that are closely knitted to each other that are allotted for conservation, where another set of lands are more allotted for developmental basis. That's what zoning means. Zoning tools means there are different ways to identify um, lands that should be that are better allotted for conservation, and to identify lands that are better that can be more effective under land development. So, kind of identifying these kind of conservation hotspots versus developmental hotspots requires some sort of a geospatial analytical tool that is based on mathematics and cartography. So I'm not going to go into details of that kind of tools, but I just want you to know it is important to recognize what part of a particular region in a town or in a county or in a state should better be allocated for conservation, and what part of area should be allocated for development. Best management practices, I briefly mentioned that one as well. So best management practices involve conservation tillage, meaning promoting soil conservation strategies in agricultural lands, minimizing application of pesticides, minimizing tillage, minimizing removal of natural vegetation. Those are the best management practices. When it comes to logging, promoting, demoting clear cutting, and promoting shelter wood harvesting, which actually includes shelter wood harvesting in simple sense involves not removing all the trees that have a market value. So, kind of leaving shelter trees in the logged land, which actually helps in regeneration of the timberland again, after several generations. Now, what is an easement? Conservation easement is kind of a conservation restriction which involves um, res- imposing restrictions or limitations on the use of a certain land area to increase the conservation targets or conservation benefits. So these kind of programs are there should be an oversight for these kind of programs, and these oversight can be provided by a state agency, federal agency, or even by a non-profit organization. So under conservation easement agreements, the landowner remains the same. Land ownership is not transferred. So the landowner preserves most of the property rights and uses of the natural resources, but the overseeing organization makes the landowner agree to reserve to waive rights that could alter the ecological integrity of that property, right? So it could be um, something regarding minimizing the farming acreage. It could be a regulation regarding minimizing constructing buildings, constructing roads, um, diverting water, channelizing water, impounding water, things like that. So when the landowner give up some of the developmental rights and uses, just like I explained, the overseeing agency will provide tax benefits, right? Um, since the landowner kind of commits himself to give up certain sources of income, so in return they get tax brackets, tax break, and the easement agreements runs with the land, so it could be transferred from one property owner to another, from that person to another. So those agreements are transferable. So the restrictions, I think I mentioned this already, the restrictions or the kind of uses and rights that the landowner gives up include forest cutting, clear cutting, any kind of a action that could impact the natural hydrology or water quality or water shading or leaf litter input. And also, in these situations, the overseeing organization may encourage the landowner to practice best management practices, things that I just explained a little while ago. Shelter wood harvesting, minimizing the harvesting uh, of timber, and conservation tillage, things like that. These kind of instruments have been extremely effective throughout North America, particularly in the United States and Canada. So another conservation strategy involves actually creating vernal pools, restoring degraded vernal pools. Those are fairly easy activities. All you have to do is locate a suitable habitat, that hydrologically um, would receive water from the rest of the watershed. And all you have to do is kind of dig a pond, dig a big hole, and of course you have to introduce certain substrate material that would encourage retention of water and kind of helps manage hydrology. So, what about landscape scale conservation planning? I earlier mentioned about conserving clusters of vernal pools as opposed to individual pool habitats. Um, and also, when you protect vernal pools across the landscape as a cluster, you have to protect pools of different sizes of different hydro periods because different hydro periods favor different types of species. Different sizes favor different types of species. Um, and also, you have to protect upland forests and other type of woodland habitats. um, and also other type of aquatic habitats like marshes, rivers, right? So, again, you are protecting everything that is critical within the watershed, and also to ensure connectivity across the landscape throughout the watershed. In this process, you can use streams and riparian vegetation as the connectivity corridor. Thereby, you are supporting migration and dispersal of vernal pool breeding amphibians, right, or vernal pool dependent species. And also, you're supporting through connectivity, you're supporting meta community interactions, meta population interactions, gene flow. And speaking of landscape scale conservation planning, to protect 95% of the populations of local amphibians in the southeastern coastal plains of United States, you require about 160-meter radius uh, around the vernal pool in the upland zone. Now you're talking about more than 8 hectares, right, in total is required to reach that kind of a conservation goal. Um, and you actually require additional 50-meter buffer zone to prevent any adverse impact coming from land users outside the previous uh, life zone. In Massachusetts, 14 to 50% of spotted salamanders generally occur beyond 200 meters away from the breeding pools, right? About 20% of the population occurs more than 300 meters away from the buffer zone. So, because of that, it is really important to protect the immediate life zone as well as the surrounding buffer zone around the vernal pool to ensure protection of the pond breeding amphibians, because pond breeding amphibians or pond breeding species may not be just restricted to the pond basin. And also, like I mentioned, in order to ensure connectivity, you have to create and manage forested corridors. Um, and the buffer zone sizes cannot be or shouldn't be a constant, right? Neither should be the size of the corridors. So, depending on the species that are using those buffer zones and the corridors, the geographical area, the climate region, the habitat conditions, the buffer zone should be kind of accommodated. Sometimes you can have a smaller buffer zone, sometimes you need to have a larger buffer zone. So do not take the previous the widths and lengths I mentioned earlier, as a rule of thumb. Those are kind of guidelines, but not universal principles. Um, So it is also important in terms of landscape scale conservation planning to set up conservation goals for vernal pools at variable jurisdictions. So you need to identify vernal pool locations. Where are vernal pools located? Right? It's a habitat that's not well known. We know where are rivers. We have maps for rivers of North America. We hardly have a map for all the vernal pools of North America. right? Um, it's really important to map all the vernal pools first, identify the locations or presence of vernal pools in the landscape, and then you need to prioritize and identify and prioritize critical vernal pools for conservation. So for this purpose, you need to select a set of ecological criteria to select, kind of to prioritize or pre-select vernal pools that are most critical for ecological integrity for biodiversity conservation. So you also need to identify threats that imperil vernal pools and then how to prevent them. So also you need to know what pools are already protected, what pools are already located in conservation lands, and what are outside the conservation land. And also, where do you need connectivity? Where is connectivity missing, right? And also use the zoning tools I mentioned before to set aside those priority conservation areas with high value vernal pools with high conservation benefits, right? And this kind of landscape scale conservation planning should involve multiple different stakeholders that have different goals. Some of them could be farmers, some of them could be private landowners, some of them could be natural resource management agencies, some of them could be natural resource managers. Okay, researchers, universities, educators should be involved in the vulnerable conservation programs. So, like I just mentioned, these vernal pools should be considered as educational resources for formal education, for training wildlife biologists, for training land managers, for training foresters, to promote outreach programs. And you can actually design citizen science programs to monitor vernal pools. And also need to figure out, across the nation, how can you embed private lands into the conservation planning. Now, trees outside forest is kind of a term used to identify undeveloped lands, forested lands that have high conservation value but are now unprotected. So we need to figure out how to incorporate those kind of undeveloped private lands, the high conservation value, into the conservation network. And also you need to, most important part, research vulnerable, study them, monitor them, right? And don't just do monitoring and research, publish them. Go to conferences, write papers, write to journals, right? You need to put your knowledge out there. Well, that's it.